Brussels, and I feel very honored to have been invited to moderate such a distinguished panel. We have 2 lawyers, an economist, 2 social scientists, and 2 historians. And that's 6 things, and there's only 5 people because one said he was both a historian and a social scientist. And we have very distinguished participants from many different parts of the world. I think you've seen the background paper for this session, and the emphasis of this session is on innovative mediation in times of turmoil. And it could not really be more timely, this. I am not going to speak for long before introducing the participants, but I think as we've already heard in several sessions at the Diplomacy Forum, we are facing a world in which there are more conflicts, lasting longer, more people being affected by violence and conflict, with humanitarian needs going up. I don't need to list all the conflicts, but there are many that often don't get as much attention as they deserve. Including, for example, in the Horn and Sudan, in Eastern DRC, in the Sahel, in the Middle East, and in many, many other parts of the world, as the Middle East, the Israel-Gaza conflict and the Ukraine conflict tend to take up a lot of the media and Western oxygen, at least. We have an extraordinary situation in which we have very new forms of warfare mingling with very old-fashioned warfare. We have robotic space planes and anti-satellite weapons and weaponization of economies and artificial intelligence alongside landmines and hand-to-hand combat and trench warfare. It's a very strange landscape out there. We also have a situation in which there are many more assertive powers in the world who are seeking to achieve their national security and economic objectives in more assertive ways at a time, and yet often resorting to military means. And yet we know from global experience that it is very rare for conflicts, for violent conflict to be resolved through military means alone. At a minimum, they also require diplomatic and other forms of intervention. We're in a world in which international organizations are struggling, whether it's the UN, including the Security Council, but also regional organizations. And I won't speak on their behalf, but obviously we have people on the panel who can speak to this. Regional organizations, whether in Africa, whether in Europe, whether in other parts of the world. On Europe in particular, as a couple of us on this panel are from Europe, I think there's a double take going on. You know, Europe has always prided itself for many decades as being an exporter of peace, and suddenly there's a major conflict on its soil, which is not to downplay the importance of conflicts that have taken place on European soil, but this is a big one. And it really is forcing Europeans to rethink where they fit in this global architecture, particularly as exporters of peace and security. The one thing I would say that I find encouraging is that the tradecraft of mediation and diplomacy has strengthened considerably in the last 10, 20, 30 years. I think there's a lot more knowledge out there about what works, what doesn't work, what contributes to lasting agreements, and there's more, university courses, and there's a lot more professionals in this space, and yet the politics is going in a direction that no amount of knowledge and tradecraft is necessarily going to compensate, for those skills. And of course, we're facing a very difficult year ahead with elections. I think there are more people facing elections this year than any other year in history in many parts of the world. And of course, there's a lot of attention being played to the US elections and how that's going to play out. There are many elections in Europe as well, the European Parliament not least. And I think, just to be a little bit provocative before wrapping my thoughts, I do worry that loss of confidence in international organizations combined with more polarized domestic politics in many countries is having a strange effect on diplomacy and mediation, in that, issues that perhaps used to be left to international organizations, or in which we would invest in international organizations, sort them out, are increasingly vulnerable to domestic politics. And so, rather than try and solve a particular problem on the basis of the history and knowledge of the area, you have to look at which party is saying what at home, and then try and figure out how that's going to translate into approaches. So we could not have a more distinguished panel, and we've had a little huddle beforehand and agreed an order in which we will do this. I'm just going to do very brief introductions. The first speaker will be Miroslav Lajcek, who is the special representative for the Belgrade-Pristina dialogue. He is a lawyer, former foreign minister, former president of the General Assembly, and ex-high rep for Bosnia and Herzegovina. I will then turn to Ali Sadek Ali, foreign minister of Sudan, who described himself as both a historian and a social scientist. You, foreign minister, are living through one of the most difficult and traumatic conflicts in the world today. So we're very grateful to you for finding the time and contributing your knowledge. I will then turn to the Archbishop, Paul Gallagher, who is the Secretary for Relations with States. And he has experience around the world, including as an apostolic nuncio in places like Burundi and Guatemala, but also very involved in issues relating to the Middle East peace process, the JCPOA, and many other things. And I think it's fair to describe you as a lawyer. Is that right?
I did the courses.
You did the courses. Okay, well then you're a lawyer. Okay, and then I'm going to turn to President Borut Pahor, former president of Slovenia, who was a member of the European Parliament. He's a political scientist. He did his thesis on peace negotiations in the non-aligned movement, a detail I picked out that could be relevant for this conversation, and he's now set up an organization called Friends of the Western Balkans. And then I will turn finally to Lise Gran, my former colleague in the UN, who's a historian and has had a distinguished UN career in places like the Congo, Armenia, Iraq, Yemen, most recently in Yemen, and now heads up the US Institute of Peace, and so is in some ways in the eye of the storm in terms of US politics. And what I find very interesting about this panel, and I think it may be relevant to the conversation we're going to have, which is about innovative mediation. What are ways in which we can think of new approaches? Is that many of you have had both official responsibilities, civil society responsibilities, academic responsibilities, so you've walked on many sides of the road, as it were, in your experience. So let me turn to you first, Special Representative Lajcek, and ask you how you think mediation is changing, and in particular from a European perspective. Over to you. And by the way, what we'll do is I'll ask each of you to say a few words, and then we can have a conversation, and then I hope we'll open it up. And given that we started 12 minutes late, I hope the organizers will allow me to run until 12 minutes late as well. Sorry, over to you.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon, everyone. I completely agree with your introductory remarks. We live in difficult times. Everything is changing, and not necessarily for better. It's clear that the world order is changing. The system of multilateral organizations as defined after the World War II is no longer delivering. Many international organizations, if not all of them, have been weakened. And I don't blame the organizations, because organizations are made of member states and of people, so that means it was our decision not to give them the breathing space. But the fact is that UN Security Council, which is supposed to be the highest authority, political and legal, is divided for many, many years. And we can feel how much we miss the role that was designed for the UN Security Council. The same goes for a number of regional organizations. I was chairing over the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, very important regional organization, but it's currently really, I would say, frozen and not fulfilling its role. So we are in between two eras, when the system as defined after the World War II is, I would say, no longer serving its role. I mean, I heard President Erdogan saying in his opening remarks that the world-based order reached bankrupt in Gaza, and this is a very powerful statement. And we do not have a new system in place, but the world is not waiting for us to put this new system in together. There are many conflicts that require solutions, and the solution can only be delivered through diplomacy. I'm therefore so pleased that this is the main topic of this year's Antalya Forum, and the mediation is the core of diplomacy. If we want to solve a problem, and there are so many of them, we need to talk, we need to mediate, we need to bring the parties to the table, and we need to help them to find a solution and agreement. So I've been somehow involved in mediation for 25 years now, and yes, I can confirm your words that mediation is changing. The main difference is that we have so many players now, and less rules, more players and less rules. We have non-state actors. Nowadays, every person owning the smartphone, which is all of us, is a journalist. Through a tweet or Facebook, you express your opinion, which is a piece of journalism, can have an impact on ongoing processes. So I would say, what I feel in my current job extremely important is to find the right balance between the transparency of the processes we are responsible for and confidentiality of talks. If you want to succeed in these days, you have to be transparent about your principles, about your philosophy, about the methods of your work. Otherwise, you cannot count on your support. But at the same time, everyone should accept that the most sensitive negotiation must be kept confidential. So, how to find this balance when people like to leak, when people like to tweet. And what is also problematic is that the discourse on the social media tends to be rather radical or black and white. So nothing is good enough. And I've also noticed a tendency to refuse the deal rather than go for compromise. And I remember one quote of former President Reagan, who said, "I would rather go for 80% of what I wanted to achieve than to jump over the cliff with my flag proudly waving." I am afraid that these days many of us prefer to jump over the cliff with the flag proudly waving, but this is not how we can achieve a deal. So these are my dilemmas as a facilitator or mediator. Speaking specifically about the role of European Union here, European Union defines itself as a community of rules and values, and indeed we believe in rules and values, and these are the guiding principles of every mediation effort we are offering in many processes. What is very specific is that negotiating on behalf of the European Union means you need to have 27 member states behind you, supporting you. That means you need to invest a lot of time reporting to the member states and making sure that they are identified with what you do. Because if you don't have the support, you don't exist. If European Union is not united, it does not exist. On the other, so this is of course more difficult compared to national states. On the other hand, when we agree on something, we are solid. We stay the course. I like to say European Union is like a tanker. When we set the course, we keep the course. We are never the first to come to the rescue, but we are always the last who stays when everybody else has left already. And we are using the elements of soft power. European Union is, as we all know, the #1 provider of assistance, development assistance, humanitarian assistance. So we are a clear example of leading by example and trying to be the soft power. And of course, our instruments are most efficient in our immediate neighborhood. European continent to the southeast, to the east, where we have a very close cooperation with the countries, and many of them wish to join the European Union in the future, and of course this gives European Union lots of leverage. So I should probably stop here to give other colleagues time.
Well, thank you. That really very interesting points, and I am going to come back to you on some of these, including the point you make about the impact of social media on everything, and in particular that compromise is becoming increasingly difficult, partly because of the polarizing effect, I think you're saying, of social media. And how difficult it is to get the balance right between confidentiality and yet public accountability. Foreign Minister, you are facing such a difficult situation. Would you like to offer some observations on the way Africa is approaching the issues of mediation, specifically in the context of the situation that you are facing right now?
Thank you so much, moderator, and thank you for the audience. In fact, let me just very briefly, in few words, explain to you why did we reach this level? Why are we, as Sudanese, fighting right now? In a very few words, we reached this situation because no respective government would allow the existence of two armies in its territory. When the government asked the Rapid Support Forces, militia, to be reintegrated in the army, this idea was refused, and later on they thought that the best way to evade this eventuality is to stage a coup d'etat and take power instead of negotiating with the government on how to achieve the integration. Yes, with this understanding, unlike any other army in the world, our army has to face the military rebellion. And at the same time, we think, history taught us that every military conflict should end up in the negotiating table. This is why, starting from just less than 1 month from the starting of the hostilities, we went to Jeddah to negotiate how to end this situation. Unfortunately, those who are mediating, they do not have the, say, leverage over the other party to force them, or at least to encourage them to come down to peace. Because in May, we signed an agreement whereby everything should have been different by now if people abide by that. We didn't stop there because when we thought that Jeddah Forum is not going well, it's not achieving what we are looking for, we turned to another forum. We went to Africa, we went to our African Union, we went to IGAD, and again, there was no light at the end of the tunnel, and we are still committed to peace. Nothing work would not achieve anything. I totally agree with the slogan of this event that diplomacy should come up, diplomacy should take over to achieve the ultimate goal of ending this war and making people return to their normal life and activities so that we carry on as a state.
Thank you. Foreign Minister, you make an extremely important point about mediators needing leverage. What was the problem? They simply did not have access to those who are taking the decisions, or the people who are supporting parties, or what was the issue there?
Well, let me talk about two different things. If we are talking about Jeddah Forum, this is the one we started with. They call themselves facilitators, the United States of America and the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. They didn't say that they are mediators. Facilitator is not a mediator. So from the start, some sort of keeping themselves away. Let people talk, let them, we just help here and there, but whatever people reach, they don't have the mechanism, they don't have the way to implement it on the ground. And this happened now because the moment this agreement was signed, the next day, the other side, the militia refused to implement it. When it comes to Africa and IGAD, I see some African, our fellows here. The problem of African regional organizations is that they don't have the ability to run their business by themselves. They rely on foreigners to finance here and there. Whoever finances your activities, your programs, influence your decision. This is the dilemma we are in right now.
Well, thank you. And I think we should come back to that.
Okay.
Let me now turn to you, Archbishop. You come at the business of mediation from a very unique perspective. So it would be good to know what you feel, the organization that you represent and fellow travelers in your space can contribute to creative approaches to mediation.
Thank you, Michael. Well, I think that the title of our discussion this afternoon is very appropriate, because I think that mediation, if it is going to be anything, will have to be, and has to be now, innovative, because the mediation that we have been engaged in to date in very many fields of conflict has not worked and is not working. First time I met Miro Lajcek was when he was presiding over the OSCE a number of years ago, and I was beginning my representation there as well on behalf of the Holy See. And the first thing that struck me in those discussions was that nobody was talking to each other. There was lots of talking to each other in between sessions, and that's fine. But in terms of the discourse in the hall, people were talking across each other, past each other. And therefore, there was really no real communication. And I think that the thing that possibly organizations such as the Holy See can contribute is really struggling with the very principles on which we're engaging and how we go about this and why we go about it. And I think that it brings us back to very simple concepts, such as sincerity. And at the present time, I think one of the biggest difficulties, it's already been mentioned already this afternoon, is that there is mediation is facilitation of negotiation. And if people are wanting to negotiate, they have to be prepared to compromise. They have to be prepared to give and to take in the process. And consistently, we don't see that today. We see people again coming together, and obviously I'm not privy to many of the confidential things that are going on at the moment, but I get the impression that people, it's the repetition, the statement of position, hoping a little bit that you can erode the position of the other by the insistence with which you present the thing. It's also the fact that what we do say is very often highly conditioned by domestic politics, that people are pursuing an objective on behalf of their country, their state, their group, or whatever, but they're not, in one sense, they don't have that real freedom to do so, because it's got to be packaged for the people at home. I think what we have to do at the moment is really to try and restore integrity and authenticity to these processes in which we're involved, in which we have to be involved, and there's a moral obligation to commit to these processes, because as one of the things already I think I've been struggling with a bit even this afternoon with the videos we saw right at the beginning of the conference, is that undoubtedly there is this spirit of indifference, that we're dealing with such atrocious realities that inevitably we have to insulate ourselves. And that protecting of ourselves can lead us into the great danger of indifference and not really feeling the fact that this is something which we cannot postpone, for which there is an absolute urgency, and yet things go on and on and on and on for months, etc. I think that that's what we feel, that we have to try and restore those principles, restore that sense of urgency, and to understand really that, as Pope Francis has often said many, many times, we have to remember, here we're talking about the lives and sufferings of human beings and about the dignity of the human person. Thank you.
Thank you, Archbishop, and I'm going to come back to you once we've done the first round, because I think you're raising something very important, which is the agency and voice of people who are most affected by violence and conflict. And, you know, arguably, what we're seeing in many parts of the world is that being reduced in terms of both shaping political agreements and in holding those who make deals accountable for their implementation. Because you can have deals, but unless they are implemented, you know, they're not worth much, and unless you really have buy-in, and that, I think, does have an impact on the nature of mediation as well, because you can mediate around particular issues or interests, but if it's ultimately about finding lasting solutions, I guess my question to all the panelists would be, does that mean that some form of identification with the needs of those most affected is necessary? Or is it enough just to represent your country or your region? Before we come back to that, let me now turn to President Pajo and Mr. President, you have both had positions, you know, obviously as a head of state and a head of government, but you've now set up an independent organization from civil society. I mean, what are you learning, you know, from this? Because these are two very, very different angles from which to approach, you know, conflict resolution and indeed conflict prevention.
Yeah, thank you, Michael. Good evening, everyone. Well, in my more than 30 years of political career, long time, I've observed one change which I think it's very important. At the beginning of my career, or in a couple of decades after, I've seen, you know, a sincere, you know, attempt to compromise, to seek solutions that would be good for everybody. Now, there is a lack of dialogue, and there is a lack of confidence, and there is lack of preparedness for compromises. Compromise is a signal of weakness. It's not anymore, as it used to be, a signal of, you know, power. There is a complete change in mentality, in political mentality, not just in my country or in European Union or Europe, but I think we can say we are observing this process all over the world. So lack of dialogue produces lack of confidence. Without lack of confidence, there is no possibility to build some sort of common future. Now, the question is, before I would answer your question, Michael, in my view, the question is if institutions, United Nations and others, can survive this transformation and, you know, rebuild their own authority without a global conflict. Or there is a necessity, a historic necessity, for something to happen, then to change this new, unfortunate mentality and new relations among world powers. As Miro has just said, once we've lived in a time of one or two power, now we are facing multipolar system, and institutions have been built on, you know, on the surface of Second World War. My strategic question is, should the world go through one more catastrophe to, in a way, rebuild institution in a new, more modern way to be once again capable to do their jobs? But as Archbishop has already said, we should go back to old-fashioned method, and this is a dialogue. I can observe in my country, in European matters, in international affairs, as I said, the dialogue is a signal of a weakness, and suddenly somebody who is, you know, keen to try to dialogue with some sort of adversary on their side is treated as a weak in this context. So changing the position, as you said, from being a politician and representing, you know, institutions, now being a founder and director of private institute, which is, you know, keen to work on reconciliation, peaceful method of solving conflicts and all that stuff. I think that maybe the civil society is now to show the official political arena that it has enough power to, you know, be involved in a dialogue. Maybe this is the way to go, but not to be, you know, naive. I think everybody, those who have political powers in their pocket, and we, without without this institutional power, I think everybody is now called to do our best to, inspire the dialogue among each other. Because if not, if there wouldn't be nobody prepared to go outside and try to find out some sort of a compromise, this wrong mentality of treating compromise as a signal of weakness will go on. So my basic answer to the new methods, new innovative methods of diplomacy would be any new method will based on the method of the dialogue. So let us, in a way, do whatever it takes to give this method, old-fashioned dialogue, its position that should be there.
Thank you. And I mean, just two reactions to what you've said. First, it fills me with deep foreboding, if not horror, to think that we have to go through another global cataclysm in order to regenerate institutions and arrangements that are going to be effective. And I'm not sure we would survive that. But I think in some ways you're referring to the Second World War, from which, of course, the current architecture emerged. And people have forgotten in many parts of the world, certainly not in Sudan and other places, but people have forgotten just how horrendous, war is. But the second point you make, I find intriguing, which is, in a funny kind of way, you're saying politicians need to have the strength and confidence to make compromises. And that is not happening. If anything, politicians are winning, feel that they get elected and win brownie points by being more and more, so I don't know what can be done about that. We can come back to it. But Lise, you're sitting in Washington. You've had a long career in the UN, seeing things from the ground up. How do you see this situation and the scope for innovative approaches to mediation, including supported from Washington?
I think there are two things to be cheered by, two very positive things if you look at creative diplomacy, and two things to be very worried about. The two very positive things are the role that civil society is playing in countless conflicts. During the time that I served, Michael, coinciding with your time in the United Nations, I was either on the front line or in a leadership position in 12 different wars or conflicts. There wasn't one where the role of civil society wasn't in many ways ahead of the formal negotiation processes. Civil society plays a role in defending citizens and protecting them, in engaging with belligerents and setting red lines for what they can and can't do, for insisting on political solutions when politicians themselves are unwilling to take those steps. You see this countless times. Some of the most creative diplomacy in the world right now is coming from civil society. I think the second thing to be very cheered about is the willingness of regional powers to step up and play a leading role. Right here in this room, Michael, right before we came in, you had Foreign Minister of Turkey talking about the leadership of the contact group that's been put together across the region to deal with Gaza. The fact that you have so many regional powers who are prepared to step forward and to take that responsibility and to use innovative means to try and deal with the toughest conflicts in the world is wholly encouraging. Two things to be very concerned about. You have a number of complicated issues, really tough ones, both in terms of domain and terrain, for which there are no existing frameworks. Mediation works best when it is nestled within accepted frameworks for behavior and action. If you look, and you mentioned this, if you look at the types of new weapons and the changes in warfare, whether you're talking about hypersonic weapons, disruptive digital technologies, there are no frameworks for these. If you look at new terrains of warfare, space comes to mind, certainly parts of the Arctic. You don't have frameworks for controlling and regulating the way that behavior of state and non-state actors will be engaged in those places. This is deeply worrying. I know that colleagues, of course, are aware that at the end of World War II, there were less than 5 global institutions that were responsible for mediation. There are now more than 110. Right, so if you look at the 75-year history of the United Nations and its associated instruments, that track record is wholly impressive. Surely, we'll come up with frameworks for those new areas. It is worrying that we haven't so far. And then, of course, the most profound worry for anyone who does mediation is the possibility that for the first time in 60 years, confrontation between nuclear powers cannot be ruled out. The system for regulating the behavior of nuclear powers since World War II, of all of the things we've talked about, is clearly the #1 priority. Reinvigorating deterrence, focusing on de-escalation mechanisms, making sure that there are incentives for restraint in action, and understanding how nuclear powers signal to each other what their intentions are, what their triggers are, and what their red lines are. The fact that this aspect of global international relations has been allowed to ossify, to wither, is perhaps the thing we should be most worried about right now.
Well, thank you. Now, we don't have that much time. We have less than 20 minutes, and I want to come back to the panelists to react to what others have said and maybe how I've reacted. But I don't know if the organizers, are we able to take a few questions and then come back? I mean, do we have a microphone, or how does it work? We have a microphone. So could the questioners, first of all, ask a question rather than give us a political speech? Secondly, be brief. Thank you very much. And identify yourselves.
Hello. I actually would like to thank you all for your contributions so far. I'm a student at Göttingen University. My name is Umut Egemen, and as Mr. Paul here mentioned, I highly believe we can't, and as Mr. Power agreed, I highly believe we can't negotiate anymore. And as the start of Gaza conflict, we saw that United Nations are actually not working properly at the moment. And I would like to ask this to all of you: are we working on reworking the United Nations? And how do you think 5 permanent members of United Nations Security Council would react to that? Thank you.
Sorry, so the question is, what's exactly the question?
Are we working on reworking the United Nations so we can take an act?
Okay.
And how do you think 5 permanent members of United Nations Security Council would react to that?
Okay. Can I take another question, please? There's a gentleman here at the front.
Thank you very much for the brilliant presentations. I'm Fonte Akum, the Executive Director of the Institute for Security Studies in South Africa. My question simply pertains to what is the role of power? I heard about leverage, I heard about smart power, I heard about soft power, I heard about hard power. What is the role of the changing nature of power in actually innovating mediation in the current global context? Thank you.
Thank you. Do we have any other easy questions like that one? We have a lady in the front here, please. We've had no one over there yet, so if somebody wants to put their hand up.
Thank you so much. I have not heard...
Could you identify yourself?
My name is Binta Diop, and I'm the African Union Special Envoy on Women, Peace and Security. And my question to this panel, I hear about civil society, but I have not heard anything about women participation in mediation and conflict resolution. So maybe this is where, when we talk about we need to come with new ways, we need to think what we are doing wrong, and maybe we have been doing wrong for a long time. And we need to reverse the table, we need to change it, and we need to bring other actors on the ground, which we are not doing yet. So to all of you, what do you think that civil society, but also the role of women and the young people as well? Thank you.
Very good point. Do we want to take one more, or are we happy with that? Okay, let me come back to the panel to react to anything that any of the other panelists have said. Mr. President, I heard you nodding to one of the questions. Do you want to?
Number one, answer to the lady in the first chair. I think the method is to include, not to exclude. You know, there is too much we're watching different crises across the world, and it seems Security Council is frozen there, doing nothing for the world peace and for the peaceful solution to the crisis. Slovenia has just recently become a non-sitting member of the Security Council, and it is sometimes frustrating for me as a citizen to watch my country, how it's not, you know, it is so difficult to reach an agreement that would solve some open questions. So my answer to your question would be, we should do the job that we have been debating on for I mean, more than a decade, and this is to reform the institution, Security Council and the United Nations, before it would be too late. I think maybe 10 or 15 years ago, the debate on reforming the United Nations could be academic debate. Now it is a highly political necessity to get there. I don't know how, but I think the recent situation in the world affairs, I mean, calls everybody to do whatever it takes for a peaceful reformation of Security Council, veto rights, members of the Security Council, and all that stuff. If not, we will lose the chance to solve questions in a peaceful way.
Can I have a follow-up on that? I mean, it's strange to me that we're talking about this extraordinary power of social media, and yet we don't seem to be able to use it to achieve greater accountability of things like the Security Council, instead of which we're talking about things which are very impressive. I mean, the Liechtenstein proposal that, that vetoes need to be taken to the General Assembly. But this is all still pretty obscure for 99.999% of the population. And if what we're saying is that politicians need to be encouraged to make compromises, fiddling with kind of procedures at the UN, of course, is important, but it isn't going to make us a big step change, I don't think. I mean, I'm just trying to be a little bit provocative here.
Well, the problem is that we have to reform the Security Council, for example, which has been based on the events after Second World War. The political and legal architecture is from that time. Now, 70 years after, with a completely new relations between powers in international arena. But the dialogue is the only way to go, and there is no dialogue on this. It is a, that's correct. I think somebody should come and give a decent proposal how to go on.
So before I turn to you, Foreign Minister, Special Representative Lajčák indicated he wanted to react.
Thank you very much, and thank you for your questions and your input. On the first question, I'd like to say that it's obvious that we have moved from a multilateral world to a multipolar world, which would not be such a bad thing if this multipolarism was based on rules, but it's not. So this is a spontaneous process, and there is a risk that if we do not agree on the rules, then this model will not be universal, but our world will get fragmented. We have different set of rules for different group of countries. And this is not the world we want. Welcome. this is not the world we want to have. We really need universal rules. And Michael, you are absolutely right. We must not wait for a new cataclysm to force us to sit at the table, because we will probably not survive this cataclysm. So we really need to negotiate rules which will be acceptable globally. And there is no better place for it than the United Nations, but we need to empower the United Nations, and we need, of course, to generate through NGOs, through media, through social media, the pressure on political leaders. They need to feel that there is a demand for new rules. Otherwise, as I said, every other option is very dangerous for this planet, which leads me to the second question about the role of power. For the power I want to see is a responsible power, and power based on rules, rather than rules based on power, because that would be extremely catastrophic for us. And the new ways which you mentioned, yes, the world is changing, the ways we do our job is changing, and this must be accepted, and therefore in diplomacy we need to accept NGOs, local expertise, women as relevant actors. We need to listen to the voices from the ground. But at the same time, we also need to respect each other's competencies. NGOs is not a government, and government is not an NGO. And sometimes it looks like government is playing a role of activists and NGOs are trying to play the role of a government. It never delivers good. We need to understand that we do not solve crisis through a hashtag or through a campaign of social media. So we need to respect each other's roles and support. And finally, I cannot agree more with what President Power said. It all boils down to dialogue. Dialogue is the core principle of everything we are doing. We need to, and dialogue means we'll listen to each other and we hear what we are saying.
Thank you. And I mean, I have to say, in response to the Special Envoy's question about women and youth, I mean, the role of women in so many conflicts around the world is extraordinary, including in Sudan, where there was tremendous bravery and leadership shown by women. Foreign Minister, you asked for the floor, but I can't resist also asking you about, you know, the agency of civil society in Sudan and what happened there, because it does not seem that that is able to affect the behavior of the parties to this conflict.
Thank you. Let me first concur with my neighbor here, President Slovenia, that we need to reform the United Nations. We need to reform the Security Council, because mainly after the First World War, we created the League of Nations. And later, after just a couple of decades, it was discovered that it's useless. So the United Nations, the current organization, it was formed, and we thought that that is the end of wars in the world, but this is not the case. Even there are more wars nowadays with the current system before the League of Nations. And even we go back to Westphalia, it was made to let Europe avoid wars, and it didn't work. Now there are very big war in Europe. So there is a big outcry all over the world, especially in the third world countries, that the UN should be reformed, the Security Council should be reformed, so that we get into another or a different system whereby we can avoid wars. As for the role of civil society organizations and women mediations in conflicts, that is very vital, very important. And I think this is one of the main reasons that, especially in Africa, we don't see any role or a tangible role of women mediation and civil society. That is why we didn't go anywhere in any conflict resolution attempts. Thank you.
Bishop, would you like to respond to some of these things? And I have to say, I'm still, you know, echoing your words about the need for a sense of urgency and integrity are echoing, I think, around this room. I mean, how can we engender that? How can we reinforce it?
The UN structures and agencies grew out of the Second World War and the disaster, the cataclysm to which you have referred, Michael. I think the UN will only be reformed if there is a cataclysm. But what we have to do is to recognize that the cataclysm already exists. The 160 conflicts around the world. Now, this might require of everybody what I would call sort of a constructive imagination. Maybe to get that sense of urgency, we don't need, and I assure the former foreign minister of Turkey that I'm not talking against, but maybe we don't need to come to a beautiful resort city like Antalya. Maybe peace conferences should be in the rubble of Gaza and on the front line in the Ukraine. For us to understand, us ordinary people, shall I say, to understand what war is, what the gravity of the situation that we're in, and the dangers that we've got. Maybe that would galvanize in us and our political representatives a desire to bring about those changes that are so necessary. I'll leave it at there because I think we haven't got much more time.
Lise, would you like to react to any of these questions or what you've heard from the other panelists?
I think what's very important about what we're seeing in the UN is that in the absence of a codified mechanism for reforming itself, it is happening anyway. And if you allow me, Mr. Special Representative, to nod to your extraordinary leadership of the General Assembly, when the General Assembly stepped forward and said, in situations where the Security Council is paralyzed, the General Assembly will play this role. Michael, you referenced what Liechtenstein is doing by insisting that in situations where the Security Council is paralyzed by the use of the veto, this has happened many times in its history. It's happening with more frequency now to the point where we can't address hardly anything of importance. The General Assembly steps in. So those of us who are deeply committed to the reform of the multilateral system are watching in front of our eyes how the member states are pushing it under leadership like yours, are pushing it into new domains and into new courses of action that were unthinkable even 5 years ago. I think we have to address, sir, your critical question about the relationship between global stability and peace and power. The point about global stability is you can have a rules-based system, but if there aren't mechanisms for enforcing those rules, then we're nowhere ahead. And the issue in front of all of us is as we move to a multipolar world where you don't have a dominant hegemon that takes responsibility, where that responsibility is shared, how does enforcement evolve? What does enforcement look like? This is the most profound question in front of us, and it's arguably the most urgent. And it's a question for which there is no forum globally to discuss it. So the United Nations discusses all kinds of things, but the enforcement mechanisms for the rules rests in only a few institutions. There are 110 of them. Only a handful of them handle enforcement. And of course, many of us would argue have done it in a disappointing way, not to the impact that had been envisioned. And yet, this is arguably the most important question that we collectively have to answer.
Well, thank you. Alas, I think we've now run out of time. I'm not going to attempt to summarize things, but just a few takeaways. I mean, it seems to me that everybody is saying that we need much more dialogue and the courage to talk to people, even people we don't necessarily like, and even when domestic politics and social media makes it increasingly difficult, that it helps when international organizations can play a more muscular role in that regard, and they are struggling. There needs to be a big boost in strengthening the capability. I thought the point about many regional organizations in Africa being very dependent upon outsiders for their functionality was very interesting. I think there's also been a running theme that, ultimately mediation, to be successful, not only has to be creative in terms of bringing in new actors while respecting, as you said, Special Representative Lajcek, respective roles and responsibilities, but you do need to bring in a variety of actors, including private sector, non-governmental, official, international. But I think there's also an issue of the integrity of mediators. And while I fear a lot of mediation is in danger of being reduced to essentially cutting deals, not enough is going into what the Archbishop, I think, is talking about, is trying to figure out how mediation and diplomacy can be used to address the cataclysm that we are already facing in terms of the hundreds of millions of people that are hungry, traumatized, the hundreds of millions of people that are in serious danger now. And these long-term problems cannot be resolved on the basis simply of addressing national interests. They require a bigger canvas. They require fidelity to a higher set of principles. And it's pretty tough to say that, and let alone achieve it in today's world, but that is what we must do. And it's funny to end on a note that the most innovative thing we can do is to go back to basic principles and be creative. But I think, in a way, that's what we're saying. Let me thank you all for being such a great panel. Thank you, participants, for your questions. This session is now over.